Welcome to the Codcast. I'm Bruce Moll from CommonWealth magazine, and we're talking with State Senator Adam Hinds of Pittsfield, one of the most knowledgeable people on Beacon Hill when it comes to state taxes and revenues. The senator is co-chair of the legislature's Committee on Revenue, chair of a Senate working group on revenue, a member of the state's Tax Expenditure Revenue Commission, and the chair of the Senate Committee on Reimagining Massachusetts Post-Pandemic Resiliency. Welcome to the Codcast, Senator.
It's great to be here and a lot to talk about.
There sure is. Let's start with the big picture if we can. Last week, the state reported that tax revenues in May took another big jump, and that overall this year, despite the pandemic, revenues seem to be surging for the state. How do you explain that?
I mean, it's true. You're putting your finger on a dynamic that has been, I would say, an unpredictable outcome of navigating the COVID pandemic and the economic downturn. I think we've seen really from the start, we anticipated having a significant shortfall of our revenues last year. And then we've basically seen month over month, we've done incredibly well. I mean, we've seen it out of the gates this year. We've beat benchmark month after month. You know, January was up close to 15%. February, I think, was over 20%, and on and on. I think when it comes to trying to just explain why, a lot of it at the top of the list, a lot of it is coming from the federal government. And so whether it's direct expenditures to businesses and individuals, that's been a huge help. And that it results in tens of billions of dollars, quite frankly, in pockets. And so that's as big as any. I think now that we're starting to move towards reopening, we're seeing that people are hiring again. We're seeing that people are getting out and about. They are spending money. And so it's still, sector by sector, we have to keep an eye on where those returns are coming in and where we might need additional assistance. But that's it's a good position to be in. We drew down the rainy day fund again during this fiscal year. At least the proposals are doing that. But to be in this position and then knowing that we have $5.3 billion in direct federal assistance to the state, nobody would have guessed we would be in this position at this point in the pandemic and the recovery.
Well, that's an interesting segue. This week, the legislature is planning to vote on this constitutional amendment to impose a surtax of 4% on incomes over $1 million, the so-called millionaire tax.
Right.
It comes at a time that the circumstances seem to have changed quite a bit because it takes a long time for a constitutional amendment to move through the process. And as you say, now we have surging state tax revenues and billions of dollars in federal aid that it's a delight to try and figure out what to do with all that money, basically. How do you plan to vote on that measure next week, and sort of how does it play right now in this type of environment politically?
Right. Well, I'll be voting for it again. I'm a strong supporter of the measure, and I think the way that we're looking at it is, sure, we do have short-term assistance, particularly from the federal government, but it's one-time assistance, and the investments that we're talking about from the fair share, namely education and transportation, need sustainable revenue sources, and so that's the it feels like a bridge to the point where we will have, should it pass, a sustainable source of revenue for these key investments for the Commonwealth. And so for most of us, I don't think that this kind of unique moment of the revenue picture is changing how we're looking at that vote.
Okay. But you've got to expect that in the debate over that this is going to become a hot topic. Does it make it do the change circumstances, so to speak, make it more difficult to sell it at this time?
The good news is the numbers are strong, both in polling throughout the Commonwealth. The votes, as you've seen, it's received strong support in the legislature, and so I don't see this changing much. Quite frankly, it's when you poll on this particular approach, i.e., folks making over $1 million per year, it resonates with people, and it still does. We've seen recent polling on this, and so that hasn't changed. It's in the 70% support range, and so people get it, and they respond even more favorably when you tell them where they're going to be spending this money. And so having that link with transportation and education has been critical for the support, and especially as we've been identifying the continued high level of needs for our schools as they navigate post-COVID realities, and as people start to get back on our roads, and so people see the value in this.
Let's go on to another organization that you're part of, the Tax Expenditure Review Commission. Now that's a mouthful. Maybe you could just explain to our listeners what that was set up to do.
Yeah, so this is the way I've been framing this is we've just gone through a budget process where we assess billions of dollars and what the priorities are, where we agree to our priorities and how we're going to spend them. And yet there's billions of dollars that the state spends every year where we do not go through that same process. And instead it's a range of deductions and credits and deferments that result in billions of dollars, sometimes for good reason, but that don't get the annual scrutiny. And so we've been trying for years, and the Senate President, to her credit, really helped to stand up this Tax Expenditure Review Commission. It's led by the Department of Revenue, and it has a range of experts and kind of inside the State House and outside. And so we've now taken a swipe at looking at the 200 or so, it's a little north of 200 personal and business expenditures on the books across income, corporate sales, and other taxes. This review that was just completed looked at 26 of those, particularly in commerce and energy and research and development. And then the commission decided early on how will we start to assess these expenditures. And so, as the report says pretty clearly, we want to know, does the benefit justify the cost? Is the expenditure claimed by the intended beneficiaries? Is the amount claimed meaningful as an incentive or a benefit? And is it relevant today? And maybe to the surprise of nobody, there's a growing list of expenditures that maybe are not either doing what they were supposed to do. They're outdated. They're not being used. They're not used by a large number of folks. And so this was an important process for being clear on how the legislature might look at these and make some adjustments.
And this the commission will do that periodically over the coming years. You looked at 26 in the initial one. You'll just keep going through. Exactly,
and it's typically a 5-year cycle, and so we have a long way to go, quite honestly. But it's valuable, and I tried in this budget, in the Senate budget, to take some of those early recommendations and start to be clear that we do want more transparency, we do want more accountability, and when this commission or a commission like this is going to do this type of work, that we actually see an outcome. And so we had 3 of those where the commission disagreed that the expenditure was either worth the money spent or was not relevant today, et cetera. And so the Senate passed that we would do away with 3 of these.
And which 3 were those?
The harbor maintenance credit, the medical device user fee, and what was the third one here? Related to the sales of certain patents.
Now those aren't exactly household subjects, so they just got put on at some point in time and just stayed there. And
that's right. And we benefit from the ability now to say, look, is it actually being used or not? And so at this point, nobody's really taken the time to do that assessment. And so we've, just as an example, the income exclusion for the sale of certain patents, it's just not being used. It's never been claimed since it was enacted in '79. So that was an easy candidate, right? There are some expenditures that we all agree are valuable. I often point to things like college savings, and you can think of a lot of valuable expenditures, maybe for competitiveness or for fairness, child tax credits, and on and on. But there are some that just really, you scratch your head. And one of those I keep talking about is the sale of vending machines, sales in vending machines. And so you kind of wonder, is this a deliberate policy for food access, or is there just a good lobbyist back in the '70s in this case?
Now, one tax expenditure that isn't so easy to resolve, perhaps, is one dealing with the film tax credit, and that's gotten a lot of attention because the House unanimously, which is unusual, passed an amendment to eliminate the sunset on the state's film tax credit and make it permanent as is. The Senate budget has taken a different tack, extending the sunset date by 4 years, but paring back the benefits, if you will, under the film tax credit and trying to encourage more investment in Massachusetts. I think that's
Right.
the overall general theme. So that was also discussed in the commission. Tell us about that discussion and what the commission recommended.
Interestingly, I think maybe I'm overstating this, but I would say we all agree that what is happening in the Massachusetts film industry is exciting. No one wants to curtail that development. I've had a production as recently as this summer in my own district. Dexter was there, and they're filming throughout the Commonwealth. What's interesting, speaking of Dexter, is that it's no longer just a film tax credit. We're really seeing an important development related to streaming programming and the credit being utilized there, because and why that's valuable is it's not say a 3-month investment in time in the Commonwealth for a feature film. Now you're talking maybe multiple seasons, and so there's a real interesting moment taking place in the last couple of years that maybe were not factored into some of the research and the data on this. And so I think that's worth noting. We've seen, and again, I saw this on my own district. You have the expenditures for hires on the film set, but then you also have, every Airbnb and hotel in the region was taken up for weeks. So I grew up in the small town of Shelburne Falls in Buckland. You have about 1,800 on either side of this river in the village, and they spent over $1 million in a matter of weeks in things like for renting spaces or food, and so it's significant, and so I think that's good. What's interesting is it's taking place alongside this conversation that you and I are having around, how do we treat our tax expenditures, and can we be a little more deliberate in understanding either the amount or the type of structure? The Tax Expenditure Commission said, look, we find that there are model expenditures or tax expenditures out there. We pointed to the EDIP, the Economic Development Incentive Program, or housing development, or historic tax credit, and the difference with those is you make it more like a grant program. You set a cap at how high it goes, how much you want to expend on that industry. You have a panel of experts that decide where those are allocated, and you have much more of a control over the jobs created or other criteria you might put in. So you're right. The design of this credit is such that you can claim a credit for 25% of the film's production costs or 25% of the payroll costs. And so we really wanted to kind of bump up the amount of time folks are spending in the Commonwealth, addressing that payroll cost size and or side of the equation, and trying to say, look, there's a limit of $1 million and the like. And so, I think there's an understanding that you can put in some guardrails and have, you can design these so you're not impacting the incentives to come to Massachusetts, allow the industry to grow while also having a little more control over it as a legislature.
So there's a bit of nuance in your statement there. The supporters of the strongest supporters of the film tax credit are starting to say that the Senate proposal would kill it, basically, would kill the nascent industry here. And you're sort of saying, no, it would just sort of control it at the margins a bit, instead of an open-ended checkbook, caps on the amount of salaries that would be affected, which I assume is designed to sort of rein in how much we're paying Leonardo DiCaprio's salary to shoot a film here, or Jennifer Lawrence or whatever. Little slight difference, but you're sort of charting a middle ground, if I'm hearing correctly, a little bit.
Yeah, that's the good way to frame it. And of course, it's worth noting we're in conference committee, and the outcome will be the result of a negotiation. And so the final final kind of structure is yet to be determined. It is true that the Tax Expenditure Review Commission, you mentioned that in your first question, they looked at a 10-year period and tried to find out who benefited from the credit. Are you in state or out of state? Who benefited personally? Is it percentage of people who are making over $1 million versus under? Is it expenditures for set construction or location fees? It cost for job leakage was another big conversation, as there's a lot of transfer of these credits, and so I think that's. I will say that the DOR data was up to 2017, and I do want to acknowledge that since then we've really seen the explosion of the streaming services and productions, and so I think that those numbers will change, and there probably is a need to expand our analysis into the secondary and beyond expenditures in communities. It's not just on set construction or location fees. There's a big impact, and so I acknowledge that with folks who are maybe on taking a different approach than the Senate did, but that's what the Tax Expenditure Review Commission looked at, and it provided a strong basis for this conversation.
So is the data very, as someone who's sort of scrubbed this stuff, the data on the film tax credit, for example, is very murky. The commission said the cost of $100,000 per job was too high. But as you say, that's based on data sort of pre-streaming. And the other side says it's totally sort of out of date now. Can DOR not do more current data than that? Or is it just, it's sort of a policy issue that's crying out for better information, I guess what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think that one takeaway from this conversation this fiscal year clearly has to be that we get a better handle on the data, up-to-date, real-time data. And I think that probably means working with the industry itself and making sure that we actually are dealing with kind of full visibility of the impact, and so the Tax Expenditure Review Commission acknowledged that they're really the credit does produce immediate and measurable spending within Massachusetts, and so that's there are some positives here. I think they acknowledged that there was the long-term impact was maybe less discernible. But again, I think that's based on a slightly outdated understanding of who's using it in terms of streaming versus film production. And so, these are reasonable things. I have to admit, increasing the number of folks who are from Massachusetts, that just sounds like a good thing. A lot of the jobs are union jobs, and so we don't want to get in the way in curtailing those. It is interesting that if you require more, because a lot of jobs are coming from around New England, I would say, employees from Rhode Island and Connecticut to work on our sites. Does this mean that we can grow the number of Massachusetts-based union jobs in the film industry with a requirement like this? So I think there are some elements of this that really should stick, and we'll see when the final product comes out.
And back to the general picture that we started with a little bit, you mentioned $5 billion in federal money sitting in accounts right now. And there's been some wrangling back and forth between lawmakers and the governor about who should control it and what have you. And the legislature seems to be stepping up to say, we want more say in how this money is spent. Why is that? Is there a perception that the governor is throwing the money in the wrong places, or what do you see happening there?
Yeah, it's no secret that the typical balance that we have between the branches was thrown off kilter for good reason during the state of emergency. I think giving the executive branch the ability to respond nimbly and in a real time to such an amazingly considerable crisis and emergency, that made sense. I think at a certain point, we need to right the balance. And part of that will come through the termination of the state of emergency. But so creating a fund, and we created this fund in the last budget, then it brings the legislature back into the conversation around expenditures, the role that we traditionally have. And so it just makes sense that we would go about this and do this sooner than later, for sure, as we're working through what will be a very transparent public process and a very thoughtful and inclusive process about how we're spending very significant funds. And we need to make sure that the whole legislature and the public is involved.
Do you have, as someone who thinks about this stuff quite a bit, do you have 1, 2, or 3 priorities that you would like to see this one-time federal money go for that you think is a high priority for at least you?
I do, and you kind of brushed up against a key piece of this is, it typically will be one-time expenditures. You don't want to create a structural deficit by, say, increasing a line item for one fiscal year, and then you're not able to maintain that over time because we won't have these funds. But for me, things like the public bank, maybe its time has finally come. I filed a bill related to this. Others have been working on this for years. It essentially, when we look at what has been laid bare through COVID and the structure of our economy, one of the things has been, we have parts of the economy and people who are impacted first and longest, typically if you're making under $40,000 a year. We have underbanked communities and neighborhoods. And when you lift up the hood and ask why, it's often, well, there's too much risk involved, and a range of other considerations. If you have a public bank, you can backstop some of the local lending institutions. They'll maybe be more willing to take those risks. Maybe they'll target communities of color. You'll target certain industries that need support, and so that type of thing makes sense. It fits the kind of dual needs right now of a strong, inclusive recovery and identifying the tools that would allow us to build back stronger and not just kind of continue with the status quo.
So for someone who doesn't follow this that close, you would use a portion of the funds or all of the funds to capitalize a public bank?
For me, it's just a portion. And it is true that the key to starting something like a public bank is that you need to have the initial holdings. And so there's, it could be in the nature, depending on where you look, you have certain examples across the country, North Dakota being one. You either can think around a couple $100 million or maybe even in nature of $1 billion. So I think that makes a lot of sense. We've seen, BECMA in Massachusetts, Black Economic Council, we've seen a lot of folks putting their weight behind this type of a concept. And I just think it makes sense.
Any other priorities you might have, or is that the big one you're pushing for?
That's a big one. I think for a lot of us, the digital divide is another one. So you mentioned at the opening, I'm chairing this new committee called Reimagining Mass Post-COVID Resilience. And it's looking at kind of 2 things. What are the vulnerabilities that we've learned about through COVID, and how do we prepare for a new reality in our economy? And one thing that has come out loud and clear has been the digital divide, and how we need to bridge that gap for folks who are either going to work remotely more often or access telemedicine or maybe continue education. And what's new is I've always personally viewed this as a rural versus urban dynamic. But really, we found that 21% of Massachusetts doesn't have a hard line into their home, and 93% of those are in our downtowns and urban areas. And so it's not an infrastructure problem, it's been a poverty issue. And so how do we ensure affordable digital access? That is at the top of my list as well. I could go on childcare, and making sure we're investing in childcare would be another one as well.
So do you envision this sort of like a mini budget? If the money is put in the account, then there would be like a separate process for apportioning that money?
Yeah, that is how we're looking at this. I mean, it's too early to say too much in detail, both in terms of the process or the spending. But putting it into this trust fund was a first step, and being clear that this is going to be a very open, transparent, and thoughtful process to make sure that these appropriations have the buy-in across the Commonwealth.
Well, Senator Adam Hinds, I want to thank you for joining us today. That was an interesting discussion. And to our listeners, thank you for listening, and we'll see you again next week.
Thanks a lot for having me.